All right. Can you hear me? All right. So I first want to thank the organizers for organizing this exciting workshop and for inviting me. So when I first got invited to this workshop and then started preparing for my talk, I was I was a little confused what exactly the agent-based model is, right? So what is that agent-based model? As long as you have some sort of prediction about the world, or if you have a world model, or if you have a prediction about the reward structure of the world, does that count as agent-based model? Or does agent-based model need some sort of action that's coupled with perception? So I was debating like a lot between two different topics that I can go into. And I just decided with the latter interpretation of the agent-based model, so there should be action in order to count something as agent-based model. All right. So while the classical open loop input outcome framework proposes this unidirectional model where the sensory stimuli cause motor response, and that's basically it. So perception is pretty passive, and then you just respond to the perception. However, in real life, that's not how it works. The perception and action actually forms this closed loop model. In other words, this perception, you can see the cursor. All right. In other words, this perceptual feedback regulates the action, and in turn, actions shape perception. In other words, how I interpret agent-based model is basically active sensing. You don't passively receive sensor input and then respond, but rather you actually make this action, and then that can actually change your perception. So a prominent example of active sensing is, for example, eye movement, where you make this sequential gazes to get relevant information from the visual scene. Or another example could be when you're looking for your car key in your pocket, and then you can actually identify your car key without looking because you're going to use your finger movements, and then there can be a lot of different objects in your pocket, but then you can actively touch and then identify where your car key is. Okay. All right, so this process is referred as active sensing. And to understand this underlying computational goals of active sensing, we propose this closed loop model where perception is driven mainly by predictive coding, which postulates that the brain maintains this generative model of the world, which it uses to predict the sensory input. And then whenever there is a mismatch between the sensory input and the internal model, it tries to reduce that mismatch as close and then make them as close as possible. And on the other hand, we model the action by using uncertainty minimization under the assumption that during exploration, animals or the agents select actions to reduce the uncertainty. So in this paper that came out a couple of years ago, my student Abdo, a very talented grad student, constructed this closed loop model of action and perception and action for intrinsically driven exploration. So in our model, the perception is driven by, I can see, yeah. So so we get the sensory input, which shapes the perception, but then the perception is driven by predictive coding. And the perceptual inference obtained from this predictive coding framework gets fit into the action module through this feed-forward network, and then in the form of this posterior distribution queue. And then this is used for the uncertainty measurement of in the entropy. So and then your next action is chosen so that the reduction in the uncertainty is going to be maximized. So, and let's look at this a little closely. So we have a separate perception module and the action module. So here is our perception module. So for the perception module, the optimization function is basically this, given by the elbow. So the perception is this approximate posterior, which is this Q. And then we can generate this perception by this indirect maximization of evidence lower bound. So if you look at our objective, we have this the first term and the second term. The first term is the reconstruction term. So this encourages the faithful reconstruction of observation. And then on the second term, we have the scale divergence between posterior and prior. So that term, on the other hand, pressures the posterior to stay, or the perception to stay as closely as possible to the prior or the prediction. So this basically imposes the predictive coding framework. All right, then we have the action selection module. And then the series of actions in this case are selected to minimize this uncertainty measured by the entropy of the posterior distribution. And specifically, actions are selected so that the agent's current uncertainty can be maximally reduced by the next action taken. And then here, the entropy of the posterior distribution Q is inferred by the perception module. So that's how we link the perception module and the action module. All right, then we then tested this model on 2 biologically motivated tasks, but they're not very biological. So first, we tested the model performance on this active vision task, where we have sequential gazes, and then the sequential gazes select informative patches on the visual scene and basically infer the hidden image. So you don't really get the full image into your system. And then the second task here is on maze navigation with controllable Markov chain, where exploration is driven purely by this intrinsic motif to gain more information about the environment. All right, so let's first look into the active vision task, where we are making the sequential patch selection of the hidden images. So this can be compared to sequential foveated gaze in animals of the visual scenes. And then here we show our experiment with this MNIST data set, but then we've tried some other data sets as well. And then here the selected patches are fed into the perception model as inputs. So here we have perception model, and which outputs the inferred posterior based on the predictive coding by maximizing that elbow object. And then the posterior, so we have this Q, posterior distribution, and then S, it could be the inferred state. And then that gets fed into the action module, which selects the next gaze location based on this. And at the same time, this inferred latent S are used as the input to the downstream classifier. And then here, note that we are not really using this classifier for our main perception action model, but then we are using this simply to evaluate the model on how well the inferred latent represents a true digit. So, and then we also tested our model on translated and cluttered images to test the robustness of our model on noisy and transform images. Right. Okay, and here's our result. So we test. So this is for the predictive coding perception model only. We tested the perception module and the action module separately, and then on the perception model, so this just shows some examples of the observed patches, so randomly selected patches, and this is the reconstruction of those observed patches, and then these are the imagined digit. So this is unobserved part. So the last column here shows this imagined full image constructed by unobserved patches from the inferred estimate by querying the decoder networks at different locations in space. Okay. All right. So this is actually pretty interesting to us because the entire image was never observed by the model, nor is it used for the training losses. However, it can still capture the spatial relationship between the patches associated with a digit from many partial observations of its images in the data set. And regarding the action model, our Bayesian action selection model, which is basically for uncertainty minimization, chooses very informative patches compared to the random selection, as you can see. And we evaluated our model against other variations of the on the classification accuracy based on the inferred latent. So here, the evaluation is based on the latent, the Q, the distribution Q, and then we are using some downstream classifier that's separately trained just for evaluation purpose. And our other variants are basically where we replaced either the perception model or the action model with something else. So the BAS and perception model, that is our model where we use the predictive coding based perception and the Bayesian action selection for uncertainty minimization. You can replace the Bayesian action selection model by just random selection, or you can replace the perception model by simple RNN. And then what we see here is that our model combining the predictive coding based perception and Bayesian action selection performs very well compared to other variants. And then we see that right here. So here the red is our model. It does better on the centered MNIST digits. Also, it does pretty well on the translated and cluttered images as well. Although the green one, the BAS plus RNN does pretty well as well. However, the advantage of our method becomes more clear when we look at the efficiency, the data efficiency. So when we use our Bayesian action selection model on the translated MNIST and use the downstream feed-forward decision network for classification, then we see this for the data efficiency. So we see that our method is much more data efficient than other common uncertainty-driven methods with intrinsic motivations. And then it's actually also better than using the full image, right? So it sounds kind of counterintuitive because we are just selecting some few patches in the image, and then it still performs better in terms of the data efficiency compared to the full image. But then it makes sense if you think about it, because for the Bayesian action selection strategy, it actually utilizes this perception model's abstracted representation of the task, right? So because it actually gets the latents, right? So that's why it performs better. We also tested our model on maze navigation task, another naturalistic task. And then here, the perception model is used to learn the underlying transition distribution. That's our observation and the learned perception. In this example, we see that the visit frequency maps explored by the BAS agent versus the random agent. And then what we see here is that the Bayesian action selection agent covers more locations than the random explorer. And when we compare the missing information for our Bayesian action selection model compared to other agents, then it's also performed better. So the missing information is computed by measuring the KL divergence between the true and the learned distribution. So as I said, the observation and the latents represent the learned transition distributions. And and then what we see here is that the BAS agent performs better than the random explorer or the Boltzmann explorer, where the Boltzmann exploration is basically such that the probability of the transition is inversely proportional to its visitation count. At the same time, the Bayesian action selection agent visits more positions in the maze compared to other agents. So it actually explores more actively. All right, so we tested our model on tasks that are motivated by natural exploratory behaviors like maze navigation and sequential gazes, but then they are still in silico tasks, right? So we didn't really test anything on the real animal data. So next we applied our model to naturalistic animal explorations to see if our model could explain the animal exploration and if it can tell us some computational goals that drive the animal behaviors. So, and specifically, we looked into these two distinct experimental data set. So in the first one, we analyzed the moth behavior when the moth is searching for nectar on flowers and also tracking the flower while it's feeding, using both mechanosensory and visual information that it gets. Then we also looked into a behavioral data set where mouse was navigating in mazes to look for the water port. All right, so regarding the moth data set, we looked into this data set from Diora et al. From Tom Daniel and Bing Bruntis lab. As you can see, the moth is searching on this artificial flower to find the nectar, which is in the center. it's a hole there, and then they can get sugar water by poking their proboscis into the nectary. In order to find, okay, now it's actually, I found it, and then now it's feeding from the nectary. And in order to find the nectary from the flower, it actually uses this mechanosensory. Play it again, maybe. I play it again. Okay. In order to find this nectary, it uses this mechanosensory information that it gets from the proboscis tip. So it touches everywhere. It touches everywhere on the flower, and then find the nectary by this mechanosensory information. So we wanted to understand how the moth does that using our model. And then the second data set comes from this paper by Stockel et al. From Simon Spomberg's lab. Here, moth is already feeding from the flower, but then the flower is moving. So even in the naturalistic environment, the flower waves, it wavers with some breeze. So the moth actually has to stay close to the flower so that it can continue feeding from the flower. And then in order to do that, moth uses both the mechanosensory and the visual information. So to explain the moth, this moth's active sensing behavior, we use basically the same model that I described earlier, with some small updates to have it tailored for the data set. But then in essence, we are basically using the generative model, the same thing. And our model implementation includes the predictive coding driven perception, and where we are trying to match the posterior as closely as possible to prior. And then we constructed the uncertainty map of the action space by computing the expected uncertainty reduction from the entropy, where the posterior actually comes from the perception model. So first, for the nectary search task, the observations are represented as forces, forces on the proboscis tip. And an experimental paper from this Diora et al. They tested different curvature of the flower surface. So the flower could be more funnel-like, it could be near funnel, near flat, or it could be very flat. And it's actually harder for moth to find the proboscis. Sorry, not the proboscis. Moth to find the nectary if the flower is flat, right? So that's the idea here. And using our perception model, we computed this average uncertainty reduction from random trajectories across a range of flower curvature. And then what we see here is that this average entropy reduction makes this rapid jump around here. So it seems like it's not really gradually increasing with the curvature of the flower. We also built this uncertainty maps for two proboscis trajectories. So in this first case, we assume radial trajectory where the moth touches from the edge of the flower, and then it actually moves radially towards the center of the flower. And then we computed the uncertainty maps for both the funnel flower and the flat flower. And as we see here, on the flat flower, the map shows lower uncertainty reduction across different positions of the flower after the trajectory completes right here, compared to the funnel flower. So which actually is expected. However, when we assume that the trajectory is circular, so the moth touches here first, but then it actually touches here next, and then here next, and then makes a circular trajectory, then we see that there is no difference between the funnel flower and flat flower in terms of the uncertainty map, which is also not very surprising. And once the moth finds the nectary and starts feeding from the nectary, then it has to track the flower closely so that it can continuously feed from the flower, right? So track the flower. So in order to track the flower, we hypothesize that the moth uses both the visual and mechanosensory information, giving them egocentric position of the flower relative to the moth. So that's our observation, the relative position of the moth, and then given by both noisy visual and mechanosensory information. And we built this uncertainty reduction map from the real flower trajectory and real moth trajectory. And then what we see here is that the moth actually followed. And then, well, so, okay, so here this is the uncertainty map shown by the heat map, and then moth actually follows this bright yellow strip where the uncertainty reduction is the highest. So it's actually pretty good at reducing the uncertainty. And then we can see that by measuring the average uncertainty reduction as well. So actual moth has pretty high average uncertainty reduction compared to the shuffled moth, or when the moth actually follows the flower exactly when it's actually superposed on top of the flower trajectory. All right, so that completes the moth part. And then, as I promised, I'm going to show you some the mouse data as well. So the second exploratory behavior data set we used is from this paper by Rosenberg et al. So this is from Marcus Meister's lab, where they use this maze, and where the mouse was trying to find this water port, which is always at this location. And then what's really special about this maze structure is that it has this binary tree structure. So it has this hierarchical tree structure. And then at each node, the mouse always has to make a binary choice, either like this way or that way. Okay. Right. Okay, so in this study, the Rosenberg et al. Found that initially the mouse is really confused. It's not familiar with the maze, right? So it actually explores everywhere before finding the water port. But then as it gets more familiar with the maze, then as you can see, it actually starts getting really efficient. And then at some point, it just goes straight to the water port without exploring much. But sometimes, even after learning the maze structure, sometimes some mouse actually do this real interesting behavior where they actually go to the water port first, but then once they get satiated, then they start exploring the maze a little bit. Okay. All right. So here, to understand this exploratory behavior in the maze, we used our perception action model based on the same structure, where the perception was obtained by this elbow objective involving a reconstruction loss and also the prediction error. And the inference made by this perception model was used in computing this uncertainty reduction. But then here, one addition we had is this reward. So we also included this reward prediction as part of our generated path in the training path when we are making this perception model. Okay. And then the observation and the infer states are this one-hot vector of the current position and the vector of the probability across the positions. So that's our observation. All right. And we found that the infer variables actually showed some emergent spatial structure, which is pretty nice. And then that happens over the course of the learning. So when we look into this prior entropy, which measures uncertainty about the structure of the maze, during the early phase of learning, it doesn't really know what's going on in this maze. So it doesn't really have a lot of information. But then within the late stage of the learning, we see that when we look into the prior entropy, it actually has very good information about this direct path to the water port, but then maybe not much in other positions of the maze. And then the same information is represented when you look into the information gain. So we see that it actually knows a lot more about this direct path towards the water port during the late phase. And when we plotted this reward prediction, remember that we have this additional reward going into the perception model. Then what we see here is that within the late stage of the learning, then it actually, we have this bright yellow here. That's exactly where the water port is. So it actually knows that the water port is right there. We also wanted to see if the emergent latent variables show something interesting about the environment or the task. So here we have a few examples of the latent unit. So I just wanted to see some single unit tuning over the maze structure. And then what we see here is that so these are just example latent units. We have 64 units. But then what we see here is that it actually shows this very interesting spatial tuning across the maze nodes, although it's kind of hard to understand what they actually represent. So Well, so after seeing the single unit tuning, the next thing to do is to doing population coding, right? So next we wanted to see whether these latent units can actually represent something interesting about the structure of the maze as a population. And this is what we see. So so when we use the whole population of the latent units and projected them onto the low dimensional space, we actually recover this nice tree-like binary structure, which is exact representation of the maze. And this is interesting because there is no explicit constraint on the global geometry at all. But then still, the predictive model could learn the latent representation whose low dimensional embedding reflects this binary tree structure. Okay, yeah. All right, so I'm going to summarize. So we propose an end-to-end perception action architecture for intrinsically driven exploration. Perception is based on predictive coding, and the action selection is driven by uncertainty minimization. And our approach leads to faster learning and higher data efficiency than alternative methods, even without explicit rewards. And when we applied this to different types of animal exploratory behavior, including hawk moth, flower tracking, nectar search, and mouse navigation, the model uncovers some interesting structure about the task and the environment. And I'd like to acknowledge the two grad students who actually led the study, Abdu and Ksenia, as well as my collaborators on this work, as well as my funding sources. Thanks.
Quick question while we set up.
Yeah, sorry.
Yeah. What's the nature of the sensory observation in the maze?
Yeah. So I mentioned it very briefly, but I know it was not clear. It's basically the transition distribution. So it's basically you can think of it as a matrix, right? The matrix, and then when given the current state where it's going to and then it's basically the full probability distribution over all the nodes in the maze where it's going to go next, given the action. Observation is the position. Yeah.
Okay.